Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I know we got people still filtering in, so I'm going to just start by giving introductions. We got a great topic today. Nick, love the title you came up with. It's a very timely topic. It feels does it feel like it gets more timely every day as time goes by? So just to start off with introductions, I'm Peter. I'm the CEO and a partner here at Anania Bailey, joined by Dustin, our account director, and also a partner, and also recently named a 40 under 40. So congratulations, Dustin, and I know I'm looking forward to that event. Hope to see some of you there. Also joined by Nick, our creative director, who you'll be hearing from a lot on this webinar. Just really quick to go over some ground rules. It looks like everyone has their camera on. We love that. We love to when people have their camera on. Just feels a little bit more immersive. We can see who's on. If you have a question or something you want to say, use the Zoom feature to raise your hand, and when there's a natural pause, we will get to you. And if you have any questions along the way and you feel more comfortable putting it in chat, or if you want to introduce yourself, please go ahead and use the Zoom chat feature. So with that, I thought I would frame our conversation about what we're talking about today. And Nick, he chose this strong image for a reason on the first slide, symbolizing the culture war that we're in right now. We're in very polarizing times, and we're seeing brands get caught up in this. And so I just wanted to really kind of frame the challenge in two different ways. And the first challenge is the negative impact for your organization for latching on to an ideology that is distant from the core values and your brand identity. And Dustin and Nick, they are going to be discussing a recent national example. I think all of you can guess which one it is, but the first challenge is getting this wrong is a great way to alienate your target audience and have a very negative impact on your organization and on your organization's bottom line. The second challenge is a little less obvious, and that's being a little too passive, and the missed opportunity in being too passive. And again, Nick and Dustin, they have a great example of an organization nationally that has done the passive things to figure out who they are as their brand, what their brand identity is, and then use that foundation to be more active. And really the missed opportunity here in being too passive is not having that breakout marketing, brand marketing campaign that brings a lot of attention to what you're trying to do, whether that is to sell a product or to commonly locally, maybe it's to recruit new employees to your firm. So with that framing of the challenge, we're going to go a little bit further, and Nick and Dustin are going to have a little bit of a debate here on being on the offensive or defensive side with your brand. So with that, Nick and Dustin, have you guys take it away.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. And thanks for those of you joining us. I know that it's kind of a sleepy Friday. Basically what we're talking about today is really just kind of insulating yourself against the ongoing, and I know culture war is kind of a loaded term, guys, but for lack of a better term, kind of insulating yourself for what is a culture war as a brand, and figuring out how you can kind of strike into conversation and engage in the space. And I don't mean engage politically necessarily, though there's plenty of that to do and reasons to do that. But what I mean is have the kind of the courage of your convictions, or the willingness to try to experiment with some big, bold messaging that'll allow your company, your organization to get some eyes, to get some awareness. There's a balance to be struck here, but for the purpose of the conversation that we want to have today, I'm going to take the offensive side, and Dustin's going to take the defensive side a little bit here, because as the creative director, a lot of the work that I do is really trying to get people to get comfortable with managing risk and saying something meaningful and trying something new that can actually break through. Right now, we're in a more context-rich environment than we've ever been, and this is true of how much video we have, the kind of commercial content, the ads, retargeting ads that are happening. We know more about the people that we market to than ever before, and that means that people are being marketed to more than ever before. And that's why you really kind of can't stand on the sidelines when it comes to messaging if you want to gain any traction. And Dustin's going to disagree with me here, but that's, guys, because Dustin is wrong. Dustin is wrong, and all of his defensive takes are mediocre at best. Dustin, do you want to misguide the community here?
Yeah, allow me to. Yeah, I look at this, in a lot of ways. Like there are some Venn diagrams where like both your offense and defense need to be on the same kind of thing. But coming from the account side, right, knowing your client, knowing what's at risk, you need to really think about, defensively, and I think that's kind of like the first and foremost part that you need to think about when you're out there and trying to communicate, trying to maximize those opportunities so you can get off the sidelines. But to be able to get onto the field, you need to have a good defense, or they're just going to dunk on you all the time. And the first part of that, right, the first defense is alignment. You need to know your alignment, you need to know yourself, and you need to know how to articulate it. So I find that regardless of whether you're going to sit out of the fight or you're going to jump all the way in, you need to know who you are, because what you're going to say is going to be reflected on your brand.
And I mean, I think, Dustin, what you're talking about is you're talking about kind of brand values and mission and having a clear sense of what your vision is and where you're operating and how you position yourself against your competitors. And I understand all of that, but I also think that is you largely telling yourself who you are, which I think is great. I can tell myself that I can bench press 300 pounds. That doesn't mean I can bench press 300 pounds. Like, the weights will tell me what I'm good at. And that's the same way that the market's going to tell you what you're good at. And putting together some sort of you're trying to align your organization just simply isn't enough, because you're going to get pulled in by stray voltage. I think a great example is the electric versus gas stove controversy that kind of popped up out of nowhere. There's a lot of manufactured outrage that's happening, I think, across the country. And part of that is finding opportunities to force people into weird corners on really weird things. And I doubt that a lot of stove manufacturers thought that they'd find themselves being dragged into a Fox News, CNN conversation around the morality or freedom or liberty of having a gas or electric stove. But that happened almost out of nowhere. And that's exactly the kind of stuff that's going to be pulling in people from all kinds of industries, whether we're talking about advocacy organizations that are inherently a hair's breadth away from being involved in politics or directly involved otherwise, to just manufacturers who are trying to balance the line between, are we green? Are we recyclable? Are we renewable? You can make that argument for almost anybody who makes or sells anything, and you're going to get dragged into this fight. So, Dustin, it's not enough to just say, like, yeah, here's our brand mission. Please just go to our website and go to the About Us section, and you'll see that we don't want any part of your fight. Thank you very much. That's not how this works.
No. And there's definitely that piece, and I can agree with a certain part of that, but you do need to have that foundation. I think that, one of the biggest problems is when you don't have your defenses, you don't have that confidence from how you've built those foundations, you leave yourself open for attack. And in leaving yourself open to attack is, a good defense is not having a failed offense, and making sure that you're going to be able to weather a storm and be able to take those kind of criticisms, take that kind of perception from the market, and to be able to address certain things. Because, a good example, right, is you can't be hypocritical. You have an energy company, right, that, let's say Shell Gas, and they talk about being sustainable, and they talk about green energy a lot, but you're literally a fuel company. Like, you can't, there's some messaging you just can't do when it's just so backwards.
Well, and I think this is part of what gives kind of a more offensively minded approach a bad name. And when I say offensively minded, I mean a company that's willing to step in and say something that telegraphs their values, because, like, what you're talking about is companies that don't understand how to read the room, right? It's not about self-actualization. It's not like we don't need to hear Cheez-Its talk about their opinion on abortion. You know what I mean? Like we don't need all companies to say all things to all people, but it's important to read the room and decide that you're going to take a step back and not involve yourself in certain things as much as it is deciding either what topics you do want to get involved in, or more importantly, where you can have the freedom to be funny or witty or broad in the statements you're making and know that you're not going to be misread. I think a big challenge that kind of what you're referencing is there's a lot of companies that need to start letting crises go to waste. There's so many micro events. There's so many things that feel important in the moment because our audiences are so segmented, because we live in these specific bubbles, that you see a lot of companies deciding that they're going to engage in conversation or topics that they have no business being a part of, or they're going to make a statement and their whole community of consumers don't understand what's going on. The days where we all watch the same television show are gone. Nobody's coming in and talking about the Seinfeld finale, right? That's not how we think about things as a society anymore, because we are all in very specialized places. And so I think to your point about like building a good defensive strategy and insulating yourself against some of that is just don't be a dummy and walk into conversations that you don't need to be a part of or that aren't aligned with who you are. Right.
Yeah.
That's kind of my take.
Yeah. And something maybe we can agree on a little bit more, right? That I think you kind of mentioned is letting crises go. And obviously we're talking a little bit about like maximizing, an opportunity to be able to kind of communicate. So like, should you be the first one in line to discuss a subject?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Unless it's something that is very specific to you, let someone else be the first one to wander off that cliff, right?
Okay.
And see where they're going to fall, to be perfectly honest, But I also think that like a lot of this comes down to understanding how we think about identity. And I think like maybe we can jump over to that, Peter, is talk a little bit about passive market and active identities. Dustin, you were getting into passive identity a lot when we started talking. Do you want to like break that down?
Yeah. So, I mean, we have to think about, when we're going from your offensive to defensive and how you're going to be sort of living in this space. Your defensive really starts at your passive identity. It's your mission, it's your vision, it's your values. It's what you put on, it's what you put out there to the world. It's how you try to identify in your market. It's what you try to do to differentiate you from your competitors, right? Those things need to have a certain level of alignment and they need to be known. But it's one of those things that is that foundational piece in everything that you do. And it exists in a lot of like the smaller items where you have like policy statements, you have disclaimers, you have code of conduct, you have different things that are around your practices. And the same thing applies to the kind of agreements that you make between your employees, between your vendors, between customers. Like there are practices that you put in place across all of these different things, like whether you're an ESOP or whether you are B Corp certified, that kind of like help patch a part of that passive identity. That's just sort of like part of you in every aspect that you're going to be doing, regardless if you're reaching out or not.
I think part of what you're talking about here with passive identity too, that's helpful is, this is a place where not only should you make sure that you're aligned, leadership is aligned with coworkers, everybody else really understands the kind of organization they're working at, what your values are, but there's also a lot of things that are increasingly expected of people in this passive identity, right? Having a diversity statement is a huge part and a kind of an expectation, not only to help with your own passive identity, but to help with recruitment. We've got a whole new generation here that's entered the workforce. I mean, Gen Z is 13 to 24, 25 years old. And there's an expectation that when you're applying to jobs, that those jobs are reflective of the identity of the values that you have. And so as a company, as an employer, right, as a brand, some of that passive identity comes in. But what I think is really interesting is the market identity aspect of it all, because, it's passive identity is what you tell the world you are. Market identity is how the world responds, right? Market identity is the market saying, no, you think that you produce high quality, made in America products, but we think that you make cheap crap that's going to hold up for a couple years until you earn enough money to buy the good stuff, right? And so what you need to do after you've built that identity, after you've created an identity that you feel is a good reflection of who you are, is take a look at that market identity and decide, what is the market telling you and how are you going to react, right? I know a bunch of artists. This is going to be a little different track for a second, but I was talking to a tattoo artist who does a lot of wildlife. I said, wow, are you a huge wildlife guy? He said, no, but I'm really good at doing birds and animals. And over time, the market told me that that's the tattoo artist that I am. Like, this is what I'm good at. This is what stands out. This is what people come to me to do. And that's what I do. And he really leaned into that. And in many cases, you might just lean into what the market tells you you're good at. In other cases, you might want to push back and make changes either to how you're creating your product or how you're talking about yourself. And I think that leads us to active identity, right, Dustin?
Yeah. Because I mean, your active identity is a lot more of your offensive, it is taking those reactions from your market identity and then being able to say, all right, what do we need to say to the market itself? And, I think the biggest challenge around active identity is thinking about all the different ways you can be able to do it, because it's more than just a social media post. So, supporting an organization or business or action, like it's everything from the communications and championing, employees, showing the support, volunteerism, or actions of the brand itself, to, thinking about, being able to have a shared platform of sponsoring things, developing nonprofit organizations around something you're very passionate about, and really showing the full value of your identity. Like active identity has a lot of different aspects to it.
Yeah, I mean, the way that I think about active identity is that it's if passive identity is telling who you are, and the market identity is the market telling you how you look, then active identity is everything you can do to change that opinion and respond. So, I mean, absolutely, it's volunteerism, but active identity is also the commercials you put out. It's the advertising you do. It's everything that you're trying to engage with on a regular basis. I mean, active identity is really where you are able to write your own narrative. Dustin and I have been going really kind of back and forth a lot, and I just want to pull back for a second. I know that there's everybody here's played in one of these spaces before, but does anybody run into a space where the identity, can think of an example, either yourself or others, where the company that you think you built or the company that somebody think they made is not necessarily the company that they're operating or how they're being viewed? Anybody have any thoughts or examples of where they've run into that?
Well, what I am noticing more, Charlie Collins, I'm with the Maine Community College System. What I'm noticing more with ads, and I'm watching, and I'm telling you primarily that comes through television, streaming television, or the ads, the local ads here in the state of Maine. Car companies giving a portion of a car sales to a animal shelter. I think there's a heat pump company that's been marketing pretty heavily and not so much talking about their services, but promoting a nonprofit with the airtime, with a 30-second, 45-second airtime. They clearly are paying for, but they're talking about a nonprofit agency in there. And I've seen that pick up. And so clearly, I think this idea of active identity is starting to happen, but I would say in a very non-political way, more shaping what it is to be living in Maine, what we might shared values of being in the state of Maine.
Do you think, I'm curious what your thoughts are on, I mean, do you feel like that's table stakes? Do you feel like that's, well, of course you support puppies. We support puppies too. Everybody likes puppies.
Right.
Do you think that's buying them anything, or do you feel like that does have a real impact? I'm curious.
I'm a puppy owner. They get me. Maybe I'll go down and look at their, I'll just say it, Subaru.
Yeah.
And I do think people who are, Subaru, it's an identity. They've done a cool job here in New England developing the type of customer that comes and buys a Subaru. And the more cynical ones of us can, you've all heard the jokes of Subaru owners, and that sort of thing. But they're not, they're kind of leaning into it, which is fine, because the reality is there are customers who values match what they're trying to identify with.
I mean, that's what I was going to say is it lines up really perfectly, I think, with the stereotype of a Subaru owner.
Right.
Like
right.
you're telling me somebody who's thoughtful and pragmatic, who has a couple of dogs and likes to go out on the trail sometimes. Perfect. You know, I mean, I think that's an example of somebody seeing that the market is kind of telling them who they are and really, like you say, leaning into it
Right.
and making the most of it.
Yeah. So, but my point is, I'm seeing more of that
Yeah.
with what I call the locally grown advert companies doing their ads locally here in the state of Maine.
Well, it's also interesting too, because Maine doesn't sit, at least mercifully yet, at the crossroads of some like really big, I would say, kind of cultural or political standoffs.
Right.
And we'll talk a little bit about where some of those might be brewing, or we're seeing some of those in a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
But I think because of that, you're able to see you're seeing organizations opting into low stakes rather than being dragged into high stakes. I'm curious. You know, I mean, I'm a relatively new Mainer. My thought is that this is a tailing indicator, though. It feels like you've seen all these other states kind of get dragged into this stuff. You've seen major disagreements happening over time, big political breakdowns. You know, crime in Northern California. Reproductive rights in the Midwest. I mean, we're seeing this happen kind of all over the place. Do you think that's maybe not going to come to the state? Do you think it's delayed coming to the state? I'm curious, like, are we politics proof? Are we culture war proof here in Maine because we're just so purple?
I think less so than some other parts. Yeah, that's my opinion. That we've had a strong history of independent, and that third rail of being an independent. There's a fairly high percentage of people who claim that independence, and we allow them. Well, if you want to get involved with the primary, just join the Republican and Democrat, and then bow out and become and then go back to becoming an independent for the general election. So that's been going on for decades here in the state.
No, I mean it's definitely an interesting thing to kind of crystal ball, and I think what it does, kind of regardless though, even if you're just talking about puppies, right, is it does kind of beg the question about how do you opt in to some kind of community one way or the other, right? And so I think that leads us to a couple of examples that I think we can talk about, right, Dustin?
Yes, and so we all recognize.
Yeah, and these are more highly political than what we're talking about, but I think there are important lessons in both that we want to attract here, because it's not really an argument about how do you get involved in toxic political culture wars with your company, but more a question of how can you co-opt causes and do that in a way that isn't gonna potentially shoot you in the foot, right?
Yeah, and I think both of these are a good example of when we're talking about alignment, because marketing is sort of that extension of brand, and we're talking about identity here. And I think it's really important because we've all seen the reactions to both of these kind of campaigns. They were national, during both of their run times, there was a lot of ups and downs, and there was a lot of feedback from everybody. So our first example is thinking about Bud Light, which happened earlier this year, supporting trans rights. And it's kind of an oddity when you think about in their competitive space, right? Pabst Blue Ribbon, Guinness, Corona, Heineken, Miller, Coors, all of them have done a similar campaign, and none of them got the kind of flack that this one stirred up at the beginning of the year. And it's a very much a good example of looking at that brand alignment and thinking about does it resonate with that audience? Can anyone here? Does anyone here know actually like what the mission of Bud Light is? Yeah, no one does, because it's such a big brand. It doesn't even have, we don't even know it, right? It's funny enough is it doesn't really even have a mission, because it's really just one little piece of part of Anheuser-Busch. And that, their mission is a future with more cheers. That's as simple as it is. It doesn't have, right? It has no teeth. It doesn't go anywhere. It's as neutral as possible. So finding a dog to choose in a bit of a culture war, right? Compared to their competitors, was kind of a little bit of a misstep for them. It didn't resonate with lifelong Bud Light drinkers. They had a huge rebuttal from the market. And, essentially they had, 30% revenue drop after the campaign, or during and after the campaign, which is significant. It changes a lot of things within the company. One of the things that I know that we looked over a couple of different numbers, but like the amount of restructuring that they did after that campaign just goes to show, like, it wasn't something that should have been the basis of a Bud Light campaign. They spoke in a way that didn't, that showed a misalignment with their core audience, and it hurt them, even though there was a lot of truth around Bud Light and this audience, right, Nick?
Well, I mean, what I would say is Bud Light is whatever it wants, whatever anybody wants it to be, right? I mean, that's kind of how alcohol is. And it doesn't, it's, to your point, Dustin, it's not like there's a specific value set there. So anybody who drinks Bud Light projects their own values onto the beer that they drink, especially if they think they're themselves as a Bud Light drinker. And so when Bud Light decided that they were going to align themselves with a specific kind of character or cause, which is what they did unintentionally, they came out in support of, I would say, trans rights. By lining up with Dylan Mulvaney. There's a huge portion of Bud Light drinkers that have no problem with that. Bud Light is actually the most popular beer at gay bars across the country. It's fine for a large portion of people who drink Bud Light. It's preferred, it's bold, it's courageous. However, Bud Light is sponsored all over the place. They're largely politically neutral, or had been until this. And the minute that they kind of stepped on what is this cultural landmine, they got huge pushback from the sponsored Bud Light bullfighting and football games, and Bud Light sponsors, rifle events and gun shows, and there's all kinds of cultural outliers among that space. So I think what happened here was that it was really just a miscalculation, where they ended up, instead of choosing puppies that everyone's on board with, and even cat people aren't going to be dicks about it, you know what I mean? They chose something that I think for many people felt like a disagreement with core beliefs they had. And for those people who identified themselves as Bud Light drinkers, they suddenly felt like they had to confront this idea of, I represent this product represents that, and these are no longer aligned, right? And you saw people who felt strongly enough that they actually engaged in boycotts. People threaten boycotts all the time. People actually followed through on that. They lost $30 million, or sorry, 30%. They lost 30% of their market share and revenue in something like a month and a half period as a result of that, and they still haven't recovered. I don't think the lesson there is don't support trans rights. I don't think the lesson there is don't take a stand politically. But I think the lesson there is kind of best articulated by the counterpoint of Nike and Kaepernick. Colin Kaepernick famously kneeled. Famously, about half the country is not on board with Kaepernick kneeling during the national anthem. He hasn't played in the NFL since 2019 at this point. In all likelihood, he will never play in the NFL again. He's just as polarizing, I would say, as Dylan Mulvaney, probably much more in the national spotlight, because everybody knew his name before Nike decided to partner with him. And nobody really knew Dylan Mulvaney nationally before, they popped up on the Bud Light radar. But what Nike is that's different than Bud Light is Nike articulates really clearly what their brand is. Nike is about competitors. Nike is about courage. Nike is about being authentic. And so when they decided to partner with Kaepernick, that made sense to people who are looking at this through that Nike lens. Nike has a set of values, and this partnership worked because this active marketing effort aligned really well with that passive marketing. This aligned well with their identity in a big way. And a lot of people said they were going to boycott Nike. Nike was getting all kinds of news coverage as a result of this. Nike got a 10% boost in revenue, and that 10% boost in revenue has maintained since they started that partnership with Kaepernick. I think that the takeaway is not the political of it all. And I would also say that even in this case, the partnering with Kaepernick, because it was political, it got them a lot of coverage, it got them a lot of news, but it felt authentic, it felt genuine, and it felt earned. And I think that's a huge part of how we think about not only active marketing, but identity when we're talking about topics that maybe we're nervous about engaging in. Does that feel like that makes sense to folks? Does that resonate? Or are there any kind of questions or counterpoints? I'd love to talk more about it if anybody has thoughts. Does anybody no longer drink Bud Light or exclusively drink Bud Light as a result of this? Anybody sitting there with their Nikes on right now?
I switched to Lone Star, but then I found out that it was Anheuser-Busch again. As many people started to do during that time.
That's funny.
Well, I don't drink Bud Light and I don't have any Nike sneakers at the moment, but but I enjoyed and agree with, all that you said. It's so true. Yeah.
What I think, and kind of getting to, Charlo's point a little bit here about like, how does this translate locally? Why are we talking about big national political stuff when we're an agency who works in New England, largely in Maine, with an audience that's largely in Maine? And I think we're bringing up a little bit because there are increasingly issues that I think are important, that are important locally, that are going to that are going to offer organizations and companies the opportunity to be more involved or more vocal. And I think this is some lessons here that we might want to apply over the next, couple of months or couple of years as different politics start to play out. Dustin, I'm from away, man, but you're a Mainer. Do you want to talk a little bit about some of these local things that are popping up and give me a sense about kind of what this looks like, how this impacts people?
Yeah. I mean, I think, we have a lot of conversations with a lot of our clients about, what they should be supporting sometimes when they are working on their brands and they want to do good and, they want to do good or they want to align themselves with certain things and they don't know the path there. And, I've seen sort of like the whole gambit, right? Everything from the homeless challenges that we are, and the housing challenges that we recognize here in the greater Portland area, to all of Maine, frankly, if you take a look at the state as a whole, to just about everything. I mean, we've got so many different challenges across the entire state, from recruitment to to off winds, offshore wind and solar energy that's been talking about, all the way to, we have questions on making our own power here on our next ballot. So like we have, they're not nearly as grand. We are a very purple state. We take everything a little more pragmatically, I think, than other states in the way that they approach it. But, there's a lot of challenges with trying to make sure that there is a genuine alignment to make sure that you are talking about a subject the correct way, making sure you're not leaving yourself open for attack. And sorry, Nick, I didn't hear you.
I don't know. Oh, I think that my wife put on headphones that automatically shot to her computer.
There we go.
Yeah, you can't have wireless headphones on in my house. I think that affordable housing and homelessness is something that's increasingly becoming a bigger and bigger issue. I mean, housing has been an issue across the country, but it's largely affected different generations, right? It hasn't been something that kind of affects all. Maine, because of housing and homelessness issues, it's a community question that we're really addressing, right? And so much of, I think, the effective messaging that I see with Maine organizations is really anchored in knowing the community, knowing who you're working with, knowing who your neighbors are. That I suspect that this housing issue is going to be one that's going to be harder and harder to escape or not reference or not discuss in the coming years, to be perfectly honest. It's kind of the number one thing that I see sweeping across, front pages, and especially when we're talking about organizations that are operating in particular towns. This, where your property is located, whether you're part of building the building ecosystem, which so many people are, from heating and cooling to paving to construction to opening new stores. I mean, there's a huge element there that I think is relevant. I think there's other stuff that's going to be a little bit of flag and see who salutes identity issues. If you're a Mainer, you support the lobster industry, right? We're Mainers. Does that mean that we're saying screw the whales? There's a nuance there, right? Everybody likes a whale. Everybody likes the lobster industry. You know, there's nuance that's in that conversation now that you're going to lose really rapidly as the Maine population starts to diversify. We're getting a huge number of people moving from out of state into Maine. You're probably going to see more of that as we get more climate refugees coming up to the state who don't want to live in 125-degree heat in the Midwest. That means that who lives in our communities is going to change, and their intuitive understanding of these things. You're probably going to end up with a lot of people who are underinformed on stuff like lobstering, having very loud opinions about the rights of right whales, for instance. So a little bit of something to consider here isn't, will politics come to Maine, or will divisive, polarized politics come to Maine, and more to do with this population is changing pretty rapidly. And you need to be prepared for, you know, like any immigrant community, they bring their own problems. That's not just true of immigrants from foreign countries. That's true of immigrants, you know, from other states coming into ours. And thinking about how to talk about these things is going to be, I think, really important for us.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, you know, as we think about, you know, these examples, what we've talked about, kind of the back and forth, you know, there are some, you know, specific key takeaways that I think that we can all kind of agree on, that we can kind of work, you know, make sure that, like, when you're thinking about this subject, when you're, you know, looking at your brand and you're thinking about how do we address these things, how do we communicate around them or through them, you know, there's a couple of things we want everybody to walk away with, and you know, regardless of how defensive or offensive you want to be, there are some things that work, you know, at that foundation. And I think the big one is know thyself, right? We have that as our first thing here, is really thinking about, what is your passive identity? What are you identifying? You know, what does your brand identify with? What are those core values? What are the things that you know, have set down and said, like, this is us. This is us. This is what our employees have signed and said, this is us. Like, knowing who you are is the first step in being able to handle any of this. Isn't that right, Nick?
Yeah. I think the other thing, we've been talking a lot about the political, but we're not just talking about political here. We're talking about just being bold. You know, we did a commercial last year for DeMillo's, and we sold them on the idea of doing a commercial that's literally around telling people not to go to DeMillo's, right? And that commercial was effective because they trusted their audience and they were willing to do something that felt a little outside of the norm, or something that maybe isn't typically accepted as best marketing practices, right? They were able to do that because they were confident in knowing who they were, knowing the audience they were dealing with, and they trusted that even if that commercial didn't land, or if that commercial didn't land with 100% of the people, it was going to be okay. I was just talking to the DeMillo's guys earlier this week, actually, and they were saying that they still have people coming in talking about this commercial that's been running for almost a year, and they occasionally have an older crowd of people who go, I just don't get it. That's been fine for them because they were grounded and they were willing to take a swing, and that swing has led to an increase in the number of the amount of business that they get in the off season, which is what that was designed to do. You know, having a sense of humor is hard to do when you worry that you're going to insult people, or people are going to misunderstand, etc. So I really want to emphasize that what we're talking about here is not be political. We're kind of using this political element as a means of saying bold, outgoing messaging is really important, and the best way to be able to do that is to have that foundation, and having the foundation you need to feel comfortable, so that you can go out on a limb and say something that's gonna get somebody's attention. Because otherwise, your growth is gonna remain not static, but you're probably not going to find huge opportunities to really jump forward as a company, as an organization, or even if you're an advocacy organization, you know, to build a lot of awareness all at once around something that's meaningful.
Yeah.
So.
And yeah, I do think that alignment piece is critical when we're thinking about this, because when you do find yourself kind of, you know, having to lean into the more political aspect of it, like, you know where you stand, you're confident, and you have the ability to communicate from a position of strength, and being able to tackle those the tougher subjects that we have to have those conversations around. And I think, our last one, stay active is important, right? You can't just claim ignorance and sit on the sidelines, in the current climate that we're in. Like, it doesn't work. Silence is not preferable. And I think it works for both sides where, you can do it wrong, but you're also missing a huge opportunity for your brand usually to be able to find, the things that resonate with you, to be able to explore those and really be able to take advantage, of where you align yourself.
When we say stay active too, I mean, stay active in the community. You know what I mean? Is a huge part of it. Keep donating to the puppies. Like, absolutely, why not? But understand what you're getting for the money that you're spending there, right? And a part of it, I think, also is you need to keep your head in current events in order to make sure that you're going to dodge potential stray voltage from national conversations. Now is probably not a great time to express a strong opinion about the Middle East, for instance, right? Understanding what's going on in pop culture and understand what's going on social media is equally important, because those state boundaries are less relevant. You can very easily go viral or be called out on a post by somebody in Florida or Tennessee, because it ends up kind of catching people's awareness. So, this goes back a little bit to the idea of have a young person or two in that office who's got their fingers on the pulse of what's going on across social. So what's trending, not necessarily to stay trendy, but more what's trending so that you know the context in which your communications are going to be taken, right? So I think that's another big element there.
Yeah.
In any case, we've been talking a lot in terms of kind of that defensive, offensive. Obviously, the answer is you need a balance of very clearly identifying who you are, what you want to be, as well as trying to help people understand and kind of help reinforce those things. But I'm curious, are there other ways that you feel really secure about building your brand, or places where you felt kind of insecure about messaging, times where you wanted to do something? I think we've all had the occasion of, I would love to do this message. I think this would be a great commercial. I think this would really catch people's eye. And then you've ended up kind of walking it back because there's concern or hesitancy or some risk aversion. I'd love to hear how you guys have sort of tap danced in this space we're talking about.
I'll just quickly share, guys, with us at the community colleges. I mean, we're constantly surveying, whether it's a class you completed or a training you've taken, and you always leave a section for real genuine comments, feedback. And if you collect enough of those and you actually read them, you start getting that sense of what your brand is. You guys said it earlier in this presentation with the word market identity. You can say, well, I think this is what we are. But then when you start collecting survey results from your product or service, or your genuine comments or your feedback, you really start to identifying what the market identity really is. And so you tweak, right? Maybe this is where we want to go, but this is really where we are. It doesn't mean we're not going there, but let's make sure the messaging is matching what people think we are.
Yeah, I mean, surveys are a super useful tool that I think people use less and less.
Yeah.
But it's one that, we're working with a law firm, and one of the things that we're currently doing with them is helping them send out surveys to get a sense of where their value proposition is, and what people really appreciate and what they feel like kind of stands out. And that, I think that's a challenge that everybody, that a lot of organizations have, rather, which is like, well, I work in this space where the difference between me and 3 other people who provide a similar service or product is pretty minor or pretty nuanced. We have opinions about how we do this work, but at the end of the day, people open the book and they go, I need this service, right? I need somebody who can help me with real estate law, right? And they kind of go to the first search in the search engine. And that means that it's difficult to understand what that takeaway or what that value is. Sometimes it's really hard to know what the market is telling you because everything is done through algorithms and search engines now too. So I think you bring up a really good point. Trying to actively understand what you are or how you're perceived is just so big.
Yeah, and the technology is just making it quick. As soon as I check out of a hotel within an hour, I've got to thank you for staying with us. Would you mind taking this quick survey?
Yeah.
You know, and
Which is
and
another
that
reason
makes
why
it-
people don't fill out surveys, is because everybody's asked for one all the time. You know
Well-
what I mean? Like
But
yeah.
for me, because it's so quick and painless, right? You don't make them too long. You make them immediate, so you didn't forget what happened. It didn't come to you in a week after because too much has happened. So I really think they're testing, the usage of this by making it quick, making it simple. And I find I'm responding more to them now than I used to, because before, oh, give us your name, put this in, no, they know who you are. All they're trying to do is capture what you thought in about 30 seconds.
Yeah, especially when we're, I think, increasingly close to our chest around my name, my address, my email address. The ways in which you can get spammed with stuff is astounding, and people are really averse to doing that too.
Yep.
Does anybody else have any kind of insights or questions or anything we want to share? We've got a little bit more time before we go. And I want to make sure that if folks have anything to share, they have an opportunity to do it.
If I could, I would love to jump in with a question for you guys. I'm Brad. This is Laura. We're from Broad Cove. Good to see you guys. Nick and Dustin, it's been a tremendous conversation. I love the insight that you guys have shared on this. Something that I wanted to ask you about is how often you are faced with a situation where potentially the organization doesn't want to get off the sidelines and deal with an issue because of their feeling about their external brand identity. But because of the internal brand identity and the sentiment of their employee base, they feel like maybe they're compelled to take a stand. Have you dealt with that, and how do you advise organizations to deal with that?
I've got a good one for that. So we had a relatively small client here in Portland, Maine, who was who's a lot of their marketing and outreach was based around working with first responders. And every year they, had everything from cookouts to community, kind of intermingling. Their business was a little difficult to sort of market because it's a non-traditional marketing kind of business. But they found a great way to be able to connect to the community through their support of first responders. When Black Lives Matter happened, there was a lot of challenges around communicating around police officers, and there was a national outcry of being extremely delicate around communicating around blue lives and all that kind of stuff. So and it lined up right around the time where they have some of their largest events around first responders, and they were so afraid of the repercussions and so afraid of not coming across as neutral, that even though their brand was very aligned to communicate this and communicate it very, and articulate it just in a certain way, since they are outside of that space, but still very much support it, that they had the great opportunity to maximize it and still show their support, and they failed to do so. And they hurt that relationship very directly. There were many first responders and the associated first responders around that too, the firemen, the EMTs, everybody was very upset with them about how they unfortunately cowered below the culture wars, stood on the sidelines and didn't do their part to help stand up for them when they needed it in our local community. So there can be a lot of challenges around that, because for a small business that can't survive a huge hit, they convince themselves that generally it's going to be a lot easier. We'll weather the storm. We don't have to communicate. We don't have to do these things. But it's tough when you have whole marketing initiatives that you put around a certain group that you align with and decide that it's too hot to touch right now. So yeah, there's a lot of different challenges around that. The conversations always get tense. and the risk and reward kind of items have to come out. And usually it's trying to balance that scale of, well, if we're going to communicate, how much are we going to communicate? And I think there was a lot of discourse around, our recommendation is to do something, not maybe as much as you've done beforehand, but to not be silent about it. And that was not the course they took.
For a couple of kind of scattershot observations on my end. One, I think what you're talking about is something that I tend to see more around left aligned organizations than right aligned organizations. I think that has to do with the fact that, and again, I'm painting intentionally with a broad brush here, but there's a belief I think that you find in progressive and more liberal leaning ideologies that puts its faith in organizations, puts its faith in large organizations and authority, right? And I think that there's something that is inherently a bit more, we're all on our own, anti-authority, or more individualistic, that you see more on that conservative side. Again, big broad brush, but what I'm saying is when we're talking about staff looking to their boss or looking to their HR rep to take a stand and lead, that's something that I have mostly seen happen along the left there. I'd also say that there's the idea that taking a stand and saying something largely means that you're putting your finger on the scale. You're trying to move something in a different direction, which I think is also something that just lends itself a little bit more to that progressive side of politics in general. Progressive literally meaning movement, right? So I think that that's something that cause-based organizations particularly need to be more aware of than some others. Because you're going to see, if you're a 501c3, a nonprofit, you're dealing with people who are already animated by action and their identity is very closely tied to a belief in something. And so I think that if you're a nonprofit, if you're a 501c3, or if you operate close to those places, you need to prepare yourself for how you manage those things, because I see that happen a lot on that particular side of the ideology spectrum. I think the other thing too is the way that I see people uncomfortable. Back to your original question about, their employees, their staff, their culture asks them to do something and they're hesitant to do so. A lot of that has to do with nuance, and a lot of it has to do with money flow. If you're reliant on donors, if you're reliant on grants, there's a hell of a lot more risk involved in making a statement or taking a stand on something than you are if you're reliant entirely on consumers, because consumers are a big, wide swath of people. Grantees are a very small number of folks who have a really disproportionate power on your ability to stay in business or keep operating. And so a lot of times, these small organizations are hesitant, or donor-driven organizations are hesitant to take a stand or move on something because they have in mind the chairman of the board. They have in mind the deputy assistant to the governor who is in charge of their financial fate. So I've seen that has a big impact on it. But also it's really hard for people to grasp nuance. Dustin made the reference to moving from Bud Light to Lone Star only to find out that it's all Anheuser-Busch. Everything is Anheuser-Busch. That's a great example, I think, of people missing nuance, missing details around stuff. When we're talking about the lobster right whale controversy, right? Like, there's a lot of nuance there about how these lines are dropped and how many whales are caught and what that looks like, and how, are there solutions and how much do those solutions cost, and how would they disrupt what is essentially an industry of independent contractors, independent business owners in the lobster industry. There's so much nuance there that makes it not, are you pro whale or are you not pro whale? But that nuance is lost when you start to try to communicate that nationally or communicate that with people who aren't in that space. So I think that I've seen a lot of organizations say, we're not going to get involved because we don't have a communication strategy that will guarantee people understand the nuanced reason why we're taking this stand, or the nuanced opinion that we have on this. And there's a shortage of nuance happening across these kinds of conversations. And as much as I want to call out institutional cowardice when people won't take a stand on something that they should. I understand that that you aren't in control of your own narrative unless you're very, very cautious or very explicit in how you're communicating. Is that helpful at all?
It was very helpful, and I really appreciate the fact that both of you guys are able to jump in with some real thoughtful commentary on the fly there. I think the one thing that I would add to the comments that you guys have both made on this topic is, as leaders, as organizational leaders, being prepared to be transparent around your rationale for folks. So while your organization may be wanting to push for commentary and maybe wanting to push for you to take a stand, if you don't think it's the right thing for your organization, be prepared to tell them why. And especially when there's a conflict between internal values and how you've positioned yourself internally and how you're positioned and how you're positioned in the market, being sure that you're able to tell your employees, hey, listen, I understand your point of view on this, but to your point, Nick, there's a lot of context, there's a lot of nuance, there's a lot of subtlety, and maybe this isn't a war that's the best thing for our bottom line.
Well, and building on that strategy, you can have a nuanced conversation with your employees because they know who you are, right? You have the opportunity to sit them down and talk for an hour. You know what I mean? You can have a listening session. You can really engage there. And to the degree if you go even one out and you're dealing with like a donor community, you're also able to have a real conversation with your donors who have some skin in the game. They understand who you are as an organization. I will say that I think a recipe when you're talking about kind of communications in this polarized world for good communications is trust, is trusting that being genuine, authentic, and a little vulnerable when you talk about these things is going to resolve all kinds of matters, at least internally, right? We assume the best intentions of people that we personally know, and we assume the worst intentions of strangers that we've never met. And I think you can cash in on that personal familiarity. And that's a little bit about why articulating who you are as a brand is so important too, because you might not know those customers personally, but if you're a brand that they've heard over and over and over again, they've seen your commercials over and over again, they've seen you sponsor every puppy adoption event for the last 30 years. They have some familiarity with you, and you have some assumed good intent. So
thank you.
Absolutely. We got about 2 minutes left. Peter, do you have anything else on your brain before we can go?
No, I think that was a great presentation and discussion. I have Dustin's email and phone. If anyone wants to carry on the conversation, I know there was a couple new faces on this webinar, so love to connect and be on the lookout for the next one, probably in December, well before the holiday. And thank you all for being on this.
Yep. Thanks everybody. Thanks for joining us.
Take care.
All right.
Have a good rest of your